I've watched the satellite feeds come through my office at the University of Chicago for decades now, and there are moments when the trajectory of global power becomes undeniable, when theory meets reality with such clarity that even the most skeptical observers must acknowledge what the data reveals. Last month, Venezuelan warships moved through Caribbean waters with a confidence that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, diesel-electric submarines lurking beneath the surface, coastal defense systems operational along a shoreline that Washington once considered entirely within its sphere of control. The deployment wasn't massive by conventional standards, perhaps a dozen vessels including transport ships and patrol craft, but the message carried a weight that transcended mere tonnage. This wasn't a regional power cowering under the threat of American military dominance. This was a state that had calculated the risks and determined that the hegemon could no longer enforce consequences in its own backyard. I've spent 40 years developing the framework of offensive realism, arguing that states in an anarchic international system inevitably seek to maximize their power relative to potential threats, and watching Venezuela's naval movements felt like witnessing one of my theoretical models materialize in real time with a precision that was both intellectually satisfying and strategically terrifying for American interests. The Monroe Doctrine, articulated in 1823 by President James Monroe, established what became the foundational assumption of American hemispheric dominance for 2 centuries. European powers were warned that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization or interference, that the United States would view any such attempt as a threat to its own peace and security. Latin American nations initially celebrated this declaration as protection for their nascent independence movements, but successive American administrations transformed the doctrine from a defensive shield into an offensive weapon. Theodore Roosevelt's corollary explicitly claimed the right to intervene in Latin American nations to prevent European involvement, which translated practically into U.S. Marines occupying Santo Domingo in 1904, Nicaragua in 1911, Haiti in 1915. The pattern became predictable and profitable for American corporations who extracted resources with minimal compensation, while local populations watched their sovereignty evaporate under the guise of hemispheric security. By the mid-20th century, the doctrine had evolved into an unspoken assumption within Washington's strategic community that no significant military development could occur in the Caribbean or Latin America without American approval or awareness. The cognitive framework was so deeply embedded that alternative scenarios became literally unthinkable to policymakers who had internalized American omnipotence as a natural law rather than a historically contingent condition dependent on relative power capabilities. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez began challenging this assumption in 1999, not through military confrontation but through ideological defiance and resource nationalism. Chavez redirected oil revenues away from elite capture toward social programs, antagonized American multinational corporations, and articulated an explicitly anti-imperialist foreign policy that resonated across Latin America. Washington's response followed a predictable pattern from the offensive realist playbook, but with a critical miscalculation about the efficacy of economic warfare. When Nicolás Maduro succeeded Chavez in 2013, the United States escalated its strategy from diplomatic pressure to comprehensive sanctions designed to collapse the Venezuelan economy and trigger regime change. The Obama administration initiated targeted sanctions in 2015, the Trump administration expanded them dramatically in 2017 and 2019, and successive American governments maintained the pressure assuming that economic starvation would produce political transformation. The sanctions caused Venezuelan oil revenue to plummet catastrophically, with estimates suggesting losses between $17 billion and $31 billion in direct revenue, though some calculations place total economic damage at $226 billion between 2017 and 2024, equivalent to 213% of Venezuela's gross domestic product. That's $77 million per day extracted from an economy through financial isolation, asset freezes, and secondary sanctions threatening any entity conducting business with Caracas. The human cost was devastating, driving millions into exile and creating humanitarian conditions that international observers compared to economic siege warfare. But the political outcome defied Washington's expectations entirely because the strategic logic was flawed from inception. The fundamental error in American strategy toward Venezuela reveals a broader pattern I've observed repeatedly in great power behavior, which is the assumption that economic coercion alone can produce desired political outcomes without accounting for target state agency or alternative patron availability. Washington believed that by controlling access to dollar-denominated financial systems in Western markets, it could force regime change in Caracas through domestic popular uprising or military coup. This assumption ignored three critical variables that offensive realism predicts will shape state behavior under threat conditions. First, authoritarian governments facing external pressure typically consolidate control rather than liberalize, redirecting blame for economic hardship toward foreign aggression rather than domestic policy failure. Maduro's government successfully framed the crisis as American economic warfare, which actually strengthened nationalist sentiment among core constituencies, even as overall living standards collapsed. Second, states facing existential threats from a hegemon will inevitably seek security guarantees and economic alternatives from rival powers, which is precisely what Venezuela did by deepening relationships with Russia, China, and Iran. Third, the efficacy of economic sanctions depends entirely on the target state's isolation, and Venezuela possessed the world's largest proven oil reserves, approximately 300 billion barrels, which made it an attractive partner for powers seeking to challenge American financial hegemony. The combination of these factors meant that sanctions created precisely the opposite dynamic that Washington intended, pushing Venezuela deeper into an anti-hegemonic coalition while failing to achieve regime change despite imposing catastrophic economic costs on the civilian population. Russia's military relationship with Venezuela accelerated dramatically after 2018, when Moscow dispatched two 160 strategic bombers to Caracas in a demonstration of extended deterrence that would have been unthinkable during the unipolar moment of the 1990s. Technical cooperation agreements followed, including maintenance support for Venezuela's fleet of Russian-made Sukhoi Su-30 fighter aircraft, radar system upgrades, and reportedly negotiations regarding missile defense systems. The Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed in early November 2025 that Moscow was prepared to respond to Venezuelan requests for essential military assistance, with internal U.S. government documents revealing that Maduro specifically requested repairs for approximately 14 missile units that he described as the most important deterrent against potential American military action. Chinese engagement followed a different but complementary pattern, focusing on infrastructure investment and financial mechanisms that bypassed dollar-denominated systems. Beijing provided billions in loans secured against future oil deliveries, invested in refinery modernization, and integrated Venezuela into its Belt and Road Initiative despite the country's economic instability. Iranian cooperation centered on oil for technology arrangements and petroleum sector expertise that helped Venezuela maintain production despite sanctions targeting its ability to import diluents necessary for processing its heavy crude. The cumulative effect was that Venezuela, rather than collapsing into isolation as Washington strategists predicted, instead became a node in an emerging network of states actively constructing alternatives to American-dominated financial and security architectures. The intelligence failure within the U.S. strategic community regarding Venezuelan military modernization reflected a deeper psychological trap that I've observed repeatedly in declining hegemons, which is the inability to accept that weaker states might develop capabilities to challenge established power hierarchies. Satellite imagery showed Venezuelan naval base expansions, Russian advisors were photographed at military installations, and joint exercises between Venezuelan and Russian forces were conducted with public fanfare. Yet the assessment within Washington remained that Venezuela's economic crisis precluded meaningful military investment. The assumption was that poverty equals impotence, that a state losing $77 million daily to sanctions couldn't possibly allocate resources to naval capabilities or coastal defense systems. This represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how states prioritize spending under threat conditions, which offensive realism predicts will always favor security expenditure over civilian welfare when survival is at stake. Maduro's government, facing what it genuinely perceived as existential American military threat, particularly during the Trump administration's explicit discussions of military options, rationally allocated scarce resources toward deterrent capabilities even as the broader economy contracted. The Venezuelan defense budget remained opaque, but estimates suggested continued spending in the range of hundreds of millions to low billions annually, despite the overall fiscal crisis, with much of that financing coming through Russian and Chinese security assistance programs that operated outside traditional commercial channels and thus remained partially invisible to Western financial surveillance. The naval surge that materialized in October 2025 involved Venezuelan warships conducting what the Defense Ministry described as enhanced coastal patrols in response to increased American military presence in the Caribbean. The U.S. had deployed an amphibious squadron of 3 warships, a missile cruiser, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, and approximately 4,500 military personnel, including 2,200 Marines, officially framed as operations against drug trafficking organizations but transparently understood in Caracas as pressure tactics targeting the Maduro government. Trump administration officials had increased the bounty for Maduro's capture from $25 million to $50 million, designated him as a narco-trafficker in explicit language intended to delegitimize his government, and conducted strikes against vessels allegedly connected to trafficking networks that resulted in 61 fatalities. The Venezuelan response demonstrated that Caracas possessed both the capability and willingness to contest American naval dominance in waters immediately adjacent to its territory, deploying what Brazilian maritime security scholars assessed as brown and green water capabilities sufficient for limited-range operations, but representing a significant political statement about sovereignty and deterrence. The technical composition included transport vessels, coastal patrol craft, and the operational deployment of what appeared to be Russian-supplied surveillance drones providing aerial coverage of the coastal zone, creating an integrated awareness picture that complicated American freedom of maneuver assumptions. What struck me, watching this unfold, wasn't the immediate tactical balance, which obviously remained overwhelmingly favorable to American forces if conflict actually materialized, but rather the strategic signal being transmitted about hegemonic authority and peripheral state agency. Venezuela was demonstrating that it could impose costs on American operations even if it couldn't prevent them, that it possessed alternatives to submission despite catastrophic economic pressure, and that the traditional tools of hemispheric dominance no longer guaranteed compliance with Washington's preferences. This represented a profound shift from the unipolar moment when American military presence anywhere in the Western Hemisphere was essentially uncontested, when states modified their behavior in anticipation of American preferences rather than waiting for explicit coercion. The current dynamic suggested something fundamentally different, which was that Venezuela had calculated that the risks of military defiance were actually lower than the risks of continued submission, that American attention was divided across multiple theaters, that domestic political constraints limited Washington's appetite for new military commitments, and that alternative patrons provided sufficient support to make resistance viable. From an offensive realist perspective, this calculation made perfect sense because it reflected the actual distribution of power and attention rather than the ideological assumption of American omnipotence that still dominated Washington discourse. The broader context that made Venezuela's posture possible extended far beyond bilateral relations between Caracas and Washington to encompass fundamental shifts in the structure of the international system that I've been documenting throughout my academic career. The unipolar moment that began with Soviet collapse in 1991 never actually lasted as long as American strategists believed because rising powers, particularly China, were accumulating capabilities at rates that would inevitably produce multipolarity regardless of American preferences or policies. By the time Venezuela's naval movements occurred in late 2025, the United States was simultaneously managing security commitments in Eastern Europe, where the Ukraine conflict had consumed tens of billions in military assistance, the Indo-Pacific, where Chinese military modernization threatened American access and alliance credibility, and the Middle East, where Iranian regional influence had expanded despite decades of containment efforts. Adding a Caribbean theater where Venezuela could impose even modest costs represented a strategic overextension problem that Washington seemed psychologically unable to acknowledge because doing so would require admitting that American power, while still formidable in absolute terms, was no longer sufficient to maintain primacy across all regions simultaneously. The resource implications were staggering when calculated honestly, with defense expenditure approaching $900 billion annually, yet producing a force structure that struggled to maintain readiness across global commitments, a shipbuilding industrial base that couldn't match Chinese production capacity, and alliance relationships showing fatigue as partners questioned American staying power and strategic coherence. The historical parallel that keeps surfacing in my analysis is the British Royal Navy's strategic predicament in the 1930s, when London faced simultaneous challenges across the Mediterranean from Italy, the Atlantic from Germany, and the Pacific from Japan, while lacking sufficient resources to maintain supremacy in all three theaters concurrently. The Admiralty conducted tabletop exercises and strategic assessments that repeatedly demonstrated the impossibility of defending Singapore while simultaneously containing German naval expansion and protecting Mediterranean sea lanes. Yet, British political leadership refused to acknowledge these constraints publicly, because doing so would have undermined the imperial prestige upon which colonial administration depended. The result was a strategic incoherence that became catastrophically apparent in December 1941 when Force Z, consisting of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse, sailed from Singapore without adequate air cover and was destroyed by Japanese torpedo bombers in a matter of hours, killing 847 sailors and shattering the myth of British naval invincibility throughout Asia. The loss wasn't primarily a tactical failure, but rather the inevitable consequence of strategic overextension, of commitments exceeding capabilities, of political psychology preventing honest assessment of relative power. Watching American strategic discourse in late 2025, I see remarkably similar dynamics where acknowledgement of limits remains politically toxic despite being analytically obvious, where the gap between rhetorical commitments and actual capabilities grows wider each year, and where allies increasingly conduct their own assessments of American reliability rather than accepting Washington's assurances at face value. The fourth theater challenge facing the United States represents unprecedented peacetime strategic complexity that strains not just military resources, but diplomatic attention, intelligence collection priorities, and domestic political bandwidth. In Eastern Europe, the Ukraine conflict has consumed approximately $175 billion in American military, economic, and humanitarian assistance between February 2022 and October 2025, with continued commitments requiring billions annually for the foreseeable future, assuming the conflict remains frozen rather than resolved. The strategic logic behind supporting Ukrainian resistance against Russian invasion made sense within a framework of deterring further territorial aggression and demonstrating resolve to European allies. But the resource drain created opportunity costs elsewhere that Washington struggled to acknowledge publicly. In the Indo-Pacific, Chinese military modernization accelerated dramatically over 2 decades, with defense spending increasing from approximately $30 billion in 2000 to an estimated $300 billion by 2025, though actual figures remain opaque due to accounting classification. The People's Liberation Army Navy surpassed the United States Navy in total hull count, operating 234 warships compared to America's 219, with Chinese shipbuilding capacity approximately 200 times larger than American yards according to maritime defense specialists. That disparity wasn't merely numerical, but reflected fundamental industrial base erosion, with the United States constructing roughly 5 vessels annually compared to China's 1,700 ships per year across commercial and military production, a capability gap that couldn't be remedied quickly, regardless of funding levels, because shipyard infrastructure and skilled workforce had atrophied over decades of underinvestment and offshoring. The Middle Eastern theater presented a different but equally demanding challenge where Iranian regional influence expanded despite decades of American containment efforts and economic sanctions that Washington estimated had cost Tehran approximately $1 trillion in lost revenue and investment since 1979. Yet Iranian proxy networks operated across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza, providing Tehran with strategic depth and escalation options that complicated American and Israeli military planning while requiring sustained attention and periodic kinetic responses that consumed resources and political capital. The addition of Caribbean complications through Venezuelan assertiveness meant that American strategic planners faced genuine trade-offs rather than merely allocation questions, decisions about where to accept increased risk rather than how to maintain superiority everywhere simultaneously. The fiscal implications were staggering when examined honestly, with the Department of Defense fiscal year 2026 budget request reaching $925 billion, including $878.7 billion specifically for military operations, yet producing a force structure that struggled with readiness metrics and sustainment across global commitments. That figure excluded Veterans Affairs spending approaching $300 billion annually, Department of Energy nuclear weapons programs consuming approximately $40 billion, and intelligence community budgets estimated at $90 billion, meaning total national security expenditure exceeded $1.3 trillion annually, roughly 13% of federal spending and approximately 4.5% of gross domestic product. Despite this unprecedented peacetime military investment, the structural challenges facing American power projection grew more acute precisely because adversary and competitor states adapted their strategies to exploit vulnerabilities rather than engaging in symmetrical competition. China didn't attempt to match American aircraft carrier deployment, but instead invested heavily in anti-ship ballistic missiles, submarine warfare capabilities, and integrated air defense systems designed to raise the costs and risks of American intervention in contingencies near Chinese territory. Russia focused on artillery, electronic warfare, and nuclear modernization rather than attempting to reconstruct Soviet-era global power projection capabilities. Iran developed precision missile arsenals and drone swarms that could threaten American assets and regional partners asymmetrically. Venezuela partnered with external powers to create deterrent postures sufficient to complicate American freedom of action without requiring capabilities to defeat American forces in open conflict. This pattern reflected the core insight of offensive realism, which is that states seek security through relative power gains and strategic positioning rather than through adherence to international norms or institutions, and that weaker states facing hegemonic pressure will inevitably pursue asymmetric strategies rather than accept permanent subordination. If this analysis resonates with your understanding of global power shifts, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss future discussions. Comment below with your city and country so we can see where this conversation is reaching around the world. The economic dimension of American strategic decline manifested most clearly in the accelerating de-dollarization trend, where states sought alternatives to dollar-denominated trade and financial systems, precisely because Washington had weaponized access to those systems as a coercive tool. The BRICS bloc, which expanded in 2024 to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates alongside original members Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represented 45% of global population and approximately 36% of world gross domestic product, measured at purchasing power parity. At the 17th BRICS Summit in Rio de Janeiro in July 2025, member states formally advanced proposals for an alternative to SWIFT, the primary global interbank payment network, alongside mechanisms for trade settlement in local currencies and the strengthening of the new development bank as a financing alternative to International Monetary Fund and World Bank structures. These initiatives reflected not merely technical financial arrangements, but rather a deliberate construction of parallel institutions that reduced vulnerability to American sanctions and financial surveillance. The strategic implications were profound because dollar dominance had provided Washington with extraordinary coercive power, the ability to impose costs on adversaries through financial isolation rather than military action. Venezuela's survival, despite sanctions that extracted $226 billion from its economy, demonstrated that alternative financial architectures, while less efficient and more costly than integration with Western systems, remained viable when backed by major powers willing to absorb those costs for strategic reasons. The domestic political paralysis within the United States compounded these external challenges by preventing coherent, grand strategic formulation or resource prioritization. Partisan dysfunction in Congress produced continuing resolutions rather than timely defense appropriations, undermining Pentagon planning and procurement efficiency. Presidential transitions every 4 or 8 years created policy discontinuity, where allied nations couldn't determine whether American commitments would persist across administrations. The Trump presidency exemplified this volatility with explicit questioning of NATO burden sharing, withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, and public consideration of military options against Venezuela, followed by Biden administration attempts to restore alliance relationships and diplomatic engagement, then Trump's return creating renewed uncertainty about policy direction. This institutional incoherence wasn't merely inefficient but actively undermined American strategic credibility because both allies and adversaries understood that Washington's attention span and commitment duration remained uncertain. Why would European nations make costly defense investments if American security guarantees might evaporate in the next electoral cycle? Why would adversaries negotiate seriously if agreements could be unilaterally abandoned? The cognitive dissonance within American political culture between the rhetoric of indispensable leadership and the reality of selective engagement created a gap that allies noticed and adversaries exploited. The industrial base erosion that allowed China to achieve 200 times greater shipbuilding capacity than the United States reflected decades of strategic choices, prioritizing financial sector growth and consumer goods imports over manufacturing resilience and supply chain security. American shipyards that had produced hundreds of vessels annually during World War II dwindled to a handful of facilities capable of military construction, with skilled welders, engineers, and naval architects becoming increasingly scarce as the profession lost economic competitiveness. The Trump administration's proposed fiscal year 2026 budget included $2.5 billion for missile and munitions production expansion and $1.3 billion for industrial-based supply chain improvements. But these investments address symptoms rather than causes because the fundamental issue was that manufacturing had been systematically offshored for 4 decades in pursuit of short-term cost efficiencies that created long-term strategic vulnerabilities. Reconstituting domestic production capacity required not just funding but time measured in decades and workforce development that competed with more lucrative service sector opportunities, meaning that even with substantial investment, the capability gap with China would likely widen before narrowing. This represented a structural constraint on American military power that couldn't be solved through budget increases alone because the problem was fundamentally about economic organization and industrial policy rather than merely resource allocation. The moral and strategic tension within American foreign policy that I've observed throughout my career stems from an inability to reconcile the nation's founding ideals of republicanism and non-interventionism with the imperial role it assumed after World War II and expanded dramatically following Soviet collapse. The founders explicitly warned against permanent alliances and foreign entanglements, understanding that external commitments would inevitably corrupt domestic institutions and divert resources from citizen welfare to military expenditure. George Washington's farewell address cautioned that overgrown military establishments were inauspicious to liberty under any form of government and particularly hostile to Republican liberty. Thomas Jefferson argued that commerce with all nations but entangling alliances with none should guide American diplomacy. Yet by 2025, the United States maintained approximately 750 military installations across 80 countries, formal treaty commitments to defend more than 60 nations, and a forward-deployed force posture that assumed global military primacy as the foundation of international order. This transformation occurred gradually through incremental decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation, but collectively produced strategic overextension that drained national resources while generating resentment among populations subjected to American military presence. The cognitive framework within Washington remained stuck in 1945 when the United States possessed 50% of global industrial capacity and faced no peer competitors, unable to adjust to a multipolar reality where American share of world gross domestic product had declined to approximately 24% and multiple states possessed capabilities to challenge regional dominance. The Venezuela situation that catalyzed this analysis represented not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of systemic power transition that offensive realism predicts will characterize the coming decades. The Thucydides trap framework developed by Graham Allison, though drawing on ancient Greek history rather than my theoretical work, captured a similar dynamic where rising powers challenge established hegemons and structural stress makes conflict probable though not inevitable. Allison's research identified 16 historical cases of power transitions, 12 of which resulted in war, suggesting that the current U.S.-China relationship existed in a zone of heightened risk. I would refine that analysis by noting that conflict probability depends heavily on whether the declining hegemon can accept reduced status gracefully or whether psychological attachment to primacy produces aggressive efforts to maintain dominance that rising powers interpret as existential threats. Britain's relatively peaceful accommodation of American ascendancy in the early 20th century contrasted sharply with European powers' violent resistance to status changes that produced World War I. The question facing American strategists in 2025 was whether Washington could transition from unipolar hegemon to first among equals in a multipolar system without triggering catastrophic conflict, and the answer depended less on military capabilities than on political psychology and national identity. The spiritual and cultural dimension that many Americans find uncomfortable confronting involves the gap between national self-conception and actual behavior, between the ideals articulated in founding documents and the imperial practices pursued in their name. The biblical warning that no man can serve two masters resonates here because the United States has attempted to simultaneously champion democratic self-determination while maintaining a network of client states and military bases that constrain sovereignty. The cognitive dissonance produces policy incoherence, where Washington demands that other nations respect international law while reserving the right to intervene unilaterally when American interests are at stake. Venezuela's defiance, supported by Russian and Chinese backing, exposed this contradiction by demonstrating that states with alternative security guarantors could resist American preferences without facing the regime change consequences that befell governments lacking such protection. The lesson that other nations drew wasn't about Venezuelan naval capabilities, but about the availability of alternatives to American hegemony, about the possibility of development paths outside Western institutional frameworks, about the declining costs of defiance as multipolar options expanded. This dynamic will accelerate regardless of specific American policies because it reflects structural shifts in capability distribution rather than contingent political decisions, meaning that the strategic environment facing the United States in 2035 will be fundamentally more constrained than in 2015, regardless of defense spending levels or diplomatic initiatives. The question isn't whether American power will decline in relative terms, but whether that decline will be managed gracefully or resisted catastrophically. And the answer depends on whether national leadership can articulate a vision of American greatness rooted in domestic flourishing rather than global dominance, in constitutional principles rather than imperial prerogatives, in wisdom rather than pride.